Welcome, welcome very much in the audience to Conversation. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome to the program Francis Peddle. He's a Ph.D. He's had a great deal of academic experience and investigation in the field of philosophy. So he's got a wide-ranging interest in the human condition, and also he's had great interest in the economic theorizing of a major figure from the 19th and early 20th century whose influence has and should even more so be informing the human experience, that being Henry George. And he's the president of the Robert Schachenbach Foundation, which is a major institution for maintaining and disseminating the thinking of that major figure, Henry George. And Francis, welcome so very much to Manhattan in New York.
Well, thank you, Harold. Thank you for welcoming me to your program. It's always nice to be in New York. Get down here once or twice a year, and very happy to come here and spend a few days with our annual meeting of the Schachenbach Foundation, usually in May, and have some good discussions over Henry George and how he might be able to make our world a better place.
I think it's a good idea. He's not given the attention that we both agree he should be given, and we want to talk about that for sure in this program. But I wonder if you could with us, we like to do it, maybe you could share in a personal vein, where you were born and raised a little bit, and your education, and then we'll get sort of grounded in that, and then we'll talk about your things from that perspective.
Right. Well, I was born in eastern Canada in a province called Newfoundland, which only became part of Canada in 1949.
Yeah, I hadn't known that.
And then I studied there at the Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland, and eventually, though, I ended up at Boston University.
With John Silver as president.
John Silver was president at the time, and this was back in the early 80s.
Yes.
And, I did my Ph.D. in philosophy there. And
oh, you did it in philosophy?
I did it in philosophy, and I then discovered Henry George around that same time.
Okay, back up just a second. What did you do? What was the dissertation?
I did it on history of philosophies of history. I wanted to look at how people thought about philosophies of history, because with the ancient Greeks, it was more just like a narrative, and it really wasn't until the Renaissance and you get into the modern world that people started to talk about, is history linear? Is it cyclical? Is it, like Vico said, it was sort of a spiral sort of thing? And I thought, well, why not look at the history of philosophies of history and see if there's a common theme or development there.
Absolutely.
In many ways.
That's really interesting to my way of
I gave
thinking.
it sort of a Wagnerian title. I called it The Twilight of the Absolute, studying historicization modern thought. But I was in my 20s and you know, everybody's kind of Wagnerian in their 20s, right?
Right. But you hadn't picked up particularly on the economic thinking then.
I started then. I was very interested in the land reform issues in Central America, which was a very hot topic at the time in the early Reagan years, if you remember. And they were in the land redistribution, just kind of taking chunks of land and giving to people, and it wasn't really working, this land reform movement. And I was looking around at land issues, and I, by happenstance, came across progress and poverty.
Okay, and you were looking particularly Latin America. They had a lot of fundistas there, tradition in Latin America.
Latifundias and very concentrated land ownership in Central America. El Salvador, I was particularly interested in.
Okay,
Very concentrated forms of land ownership in most of these countries.
And that had political implications.
Political implications. There was a civil war going on at the time. It was messy. There were a lot of people dying, and the economic inequality and poverty was just horrendous.
Yes, right.
But I didn't think how we were going about dealing with that was really very effective. The West and the NGOs and all these organizations. And I stumbled upon Henry George's Progress in Poverty while I was doing that.
That was a bit of a jump from the philosophy of the history of the philosophies of the world to land
in a way not,
because
because I like to think of George as a philosopher, really.
Good.
He's a multifaceted figure. So if someone asks me, who's Henry George, I'll say, well, I think he's a philosopher of economics, but he's also a social philosopher.
Right.
He has a philosophy of history, I think, towards the end of Progress and Poverty. So there's lots of ways you can encounter George, and you can take him as a politician if you want, because he ran to be mayor of New York in 1886 and almost won. So he's a very multifaceted figure in that way, and not just a narrow economist.
Yeah, and it might be a good time for us to introduce and bring into your land issues and your own personal background, but bring in the person of Henry George. Born and raised, his influence, you wrote 79 or something?
Yeah, he was born in Philadelphia, but spent the better part of his life here in New York. And in 1879, he brought out this book, Progress and Poverty, which was probably the most popular and most widely translated book in economic history certainly in the 19th century.
He had a huge following
Huge
among
following
the intellectuals
globally.
of the time.
Even in Canada, there were all kinds of schools of Henry George. They're mostly gone and defunct now, but
Yeah.
even up to about 40 years ago, there were schools of, used to call them schools of economic science and that. But
They
they're
did
really
call-
Henry
they
George
tried to
schools.
call-
Yeah, because they thought of economics as a science, and which was important. You know, George himself certainly thought of political economy as a science.
Yeah,
okay? And these schools sprouted all up over the world, in
Yeah.
Australia and in England.
Sun
and
Yat-sen was
Sun
into it?
Yat-sen was into
Yeah,
it.
some of the people, you can roll them off.
Oh
the
yeah,
people
I
that
gave
were
a
in his
paper on
camp.
Sun Yat-sen and Henry
Yeah.
George in China about 8 years ago. And,
Right.
amazing history there. And of course, in New York, there's a New York Henry George School.
Yes, there is
that's-
now, yeah,
That has been here since the 1930s.
But
actually.
coming up to the turn of the century and everything, and they had all the intellectual, it seems to be the
Yeah.
people you can tick off. Tolstoy was
Winston
a follower.
Churchill.
Winston Churchill. Yeah,
Clarence Darrow.
Clarence Darrow, my hero.
Your
My
right.
hero, yeah.
Endless people.
Yeah,
who,
the intellectual class, more or less, were very
were
much
exposed to it.
Mark Twain was a follower, right?
Well, they were certainly exposed to it. The key
Yeah.
here is that it was in the air, so
You're
to
right,
speak.
right.
And people reacted, you know, for it or against it. But John Dewey, a great philosopher,
John
for
Dewey
instance,
again, a giant.
he
yeah.
actually supervised the thesis on Henry George of George Geiger, who was the son of the founder of the New York Henry George School.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And called The Philosophy of Henry George. So
Uh-huh.
John Dewey's, for instance, a very famous American
Absolutely,
philosopher,
yeah,
said
yeah.
George
Education.
George is the person.
Right.
And in this book, or this journal I put out here 3 years ago, which was a special issue on Henry George from
They
the
may be
International,
able to come in on that.
in
I'm
the
not sure, but
International
yeah.
Journal of Social Economics, I have an introduction here of a radio broadcast that John Dewey made in New York in at the depths of the Depression in 1932. Henry
Wow.
George was old hat then, he was 50 years,
Yeah.
sort of thing, saying, we have to go back to this to try to solve the problems of the
So-
Great Depression.
And
at
do
the
we have
time."
that audio tape? Does it exist?
I think
You
I
have a
have
transcript
Well, I
of it.
have the transcript,
Yeah,
which
right.
was published in the collected works of John Dewey, and they gave me permission to put it in this journal. It's a very short thing. It's about 2.5 pages or so, but
Oh.
it is a fascinating work
Uh-huh.
because even in the early 1930s, you can see that very, fundamental figures in American thinking, like Dewey, were still thinking of Henry George.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, now that's all gone. And since the Second World War, and certainly the last 30, 40 years, Henry George, he hardly gets mentioned in a history of economics
We'd like to change
textbook.
that here today if we can.
Well, maybe we will, right? Maybe this will be a world historical
Yeah,
event somehow,
right.
But he doesn't get mentioned. He's certainly not taught in any systematic way in the mainstream economics. There are what they call now heterodox economics, a bit that may look at it and so on. And there's certainly economists. You've interviewed a couple of them here on your own
Yeah,
program.
yeah.
Dr. Polly Cleveland, Dr.
Yeah.
Mason Gaffney,
Yeah.
who certainly have devoted a lot of their research and to Henry George.
Yeah.
But it's not anything like, there's, economists everywhere, and the vast majority of them don't really know much about it.
No, the canon, as we call it, is
The-
the canon keepers aren't
The canon,
inclusive
enough.
enough.
They're an inclusive club, but they've excluded certain people in Henry George.
Yeah, you
is
were
one
talking
of them.
about trying to make it a science. That was Friedman wanted to make it a science, you
Yeah.
know, like that. Yeah, right, and everything. But so he's amazing. So what was it that was distinctive about him that he was able to gain such attention? What was his major theme, major premise, and so forth? And so that might be relevant.
Right.
And is he relevant today? It seems to me he's still relevant today to the things that were being confronted in the modern
Well,
world.
that's why I did this issue, this
Yeah.
special issue 3 years ago, because I thought he was very relevant to the financial crisis.
thing of
And actually,
2008,
it was economists, Fred Fulvery, for instance, who predicted exactly the financial crisis of 2008 in an article in 1997.
Really?
He almost won a prize for being. So the later people
Prescient,
like
yeah.
Nouriel Roubini and that who predicted the financial
Roubini,
crisis.
yeah, he's in New York, yeah, yeah.
They were much later, and they didn't predict it as accurately as the Georgists. So the
Yeah.
Georgists tend to see 18-year real estate cycles.
18-year
real estate cycles. And so, and they have a lot of research, historical research that goes on about that. George himself, we may go back for a minute to the 19th century.
Sure.
He had two issues, really fundamental issues as I see it. One is he could not reconcile industrial progress with increasing poverty.
Okay.
And that's
yeah.
why I call it why do we have progress and yet we seem to have intensification of poverty?
Yeah.
Especially in cities. As people tend to urbanize more, you get these vast discrepancies.
Dickensian stuff. Yeah.
Dickensian stuff, and in a way, he's the first urban economist of the discipline in the late 19th century.
And that was certainly a move that was going on, and it's picked up.
Yeah. And
then we're becoming an urban planet.
Well, 80% of Canadians, for instance, are urbanized.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, that's where the wealth is created. That's where things going on. Georgia's still relevant for that, even though you don't think land is there until it gets flooded like Lower Manhattan did during Hurricane Sandy, right? You kind of forget about the land, but it's really important. The other big issue, in my view, is that he wanted to get at the whole issue, what they used to call at the time industrial fluctuations or depressions. Well, industrial depressions.
Oh, yeah, okay,
These cycles where things get built up and all this speculation's going on, and then everything collapses.
Yeah.
And he said, this is disastrous for the vast majority of people.
It's been just consistent, 1837, 1857, everything.
He was responding to one, when he wrote the book in the late 1870s, he was responding to an industrial depression at the time. Now we call it the Great Recession, the recent one, but you know, what a depression is and what is a recession is rather a vague thing.
Yeah.
But in the 1930s.
And then, of course, we in the modern experience, the 2930, that was the Great Depression.
Right, that was the Depression.
Right.
And that was the term they used, and it's actually in the subtitle of Progress and Poverty. You know, he's looking into the cause of industrial depressions.
It's interesting, he had an 18-year cycle. A lot of people see that as a generational cycle, that they go through a thing, you know, the thing is all a bubble and everything, and they go through, it's generational. So the generation forgets what had been so terrible, and then they taste
in 2006, if you said to anybody in America that house prices may go down 40 or 50%, they would have treated you as being crazy.
Well,
and that's not that long ago, right?
That's absolutely true. It seems to me.
But if you studied Henry George, you would say, oh, yeah, well, I understand, because Georgians were saying all the time, this is going to blow. Like,
because they predicted it, but they predicted it on an 18-year cycle.
They did, and the last one was,
what would be the occurrences that would occur 18 years apart, roughly, that would cause the bubble and the bursting of a real estate-based?
Well, there's a nadir of about 7 years, which we seem to have been in since 2008. The last one would have been in the early 1990s.
Okay.
And then you get a build-up again over another 7 or 8 year period. And so you eventually, you know, they're saying now the next peak will be, because we're not really doing anything except printing money to deal with the current crisis in 2026. We have made no fundamental changes to our institutional structures, our tax structure, our public finance structure, how we finance all this stuff in real estate and so on. The real estate industry pays virtually no tax. We have done nothing of any significance to really respond to the crisis that came in 2008.
Well, after the Great Depression, I was born in 35, so I was born at the end of that and everything, and that was the focus of great attention at the time when that happened, and there were things that were done, New Deal and so forth.
Yeah, but there was massive real estate speculation in the 1920s.
Well, real estate speculation would be something that was part of a general speculative bubble that was allowed to grow.
But you have to think,
put particular attention upon the real estate market.
Well, I would use Winston Churchill's moniker on that. He said the real estate monopoly or the land monopoly is the mother of all monopolies. It's the one underneath everything that sort of bases all this other speculation that goes on in finance and in how we, you know, print money and how we deal with that and how we deal with financial intermediaries and all these things.
And I think we ought to make it clear that real estate, people think of real estate like buying a house or something, but real estate and his notion of that involved not only real estate, if I may, you set me straight in everything, but it was, and that in a certain sense was a land, they used the term land, and that was used for the natural resource base that has been intrinsic to the planet. That's really what they're talking about.
He used the word land at the time to include all of nature. Of
course, all of nature, okay, that's bigger than land.
The God-given, you know, thing, that whatever is not human created.
Right.
We today, of course, would greatly expand that to the broadcast spectrum, for instance, right?
Well, that's become available
like
to us,
orbital parking spots, you could even say. Airport landing slots are very valuable.
It's getting crowded up there now.
Well, anything that preempts, you know, it's sort of a different view of monopoly in some ways. And monopoly is really important here because George really hated monopolies.
Yeah, well, so did Teddy Roosevelt. Did he not? Trust busting?
But monopoly here is...
What was Teddy Roosevelt's attitude toward the history or the trust busting?
But if I may talk about monopoly for a minute in the unique George's sense, you have to think it was preempting other people from using that spot.
Right.
And if you do that, like a parking meter, for instance, you put money in, you preempt somebody from using that parking
That's
spot
true.
for an hour.
Yeah, right.
But you also pay to the community for the right to do that, because everybody has the right of access to that spot.
Right.
If you're going to have exclusive access at that point, then you ought to compensate the rest of us for doing that,
I see.
which
That's
is what they do, right?
That's a principle.
So it's preempting these slots,
Yeah,
these spatial slots and
yeah.
time slots and things like that, was really at the core of the George's view of monopoly.
I
It's
see.
not just market share or controlling market share and things like that. So
yeah.
you need to kind of think about what monopoly really is. Of course, if you monopolize in some sense because of a legal document
Yeah.
or a piece of paper that gives you title to something, gives you
Yeah.
the right to get rid of anybody else, and you just either steal it or you use military force to get it or you annex it or however you get it.
Been a
right?
lot of that in history.
Been a lot of that in history, and
Yeah.
history's been very bloody
Yeah,
over this whole
yeah.
thing. Then you're able to exclude other people, and you have the system, the institutional laws in that would enable you to do that. But when you're in a city like Manhattan,
Yeah, yeah.
you have this vast synergistic economic structure around you that creates these values. So
Right.
the airwaves above us here
Yeah.
in Manhattan are much more valuable than they would be at the North Pole
Yeah.
because
Yeah,
of this
okay.
concentration.
Yeah.
So we call, in our philosophical thinking, we call these community-created values.
Community creative. Okay,
values.
yeah, okay.
And we think that ought to be the basis for getting back most of the public revenue to run the things we need to do to make our society livable. You know, garbage collection, the streets, and all of these
Those
things.
things are all necessary.
They're
yeah,
all necessary for
absolutely.
us to be able to live together in
Yeah.
a city like this.
Right.
And where are we going to get the revenue from? And George did not want you to get the revenue from your income, from your own labor. He said you
Okay.
had the right to that labor. However, you don't have...
Was he in favor of the labor theory of value as the
Well, he
Marxists
modified
were?
that. No,
He
he
modified it.
modified that.
Okay.
He went further than that. But
Yeah.
we sometimes call it the producerist revolution,
Yeah.
in that he really wanted to reduce taxation on producers and your own effort and shift it to these community-created
land.
values. Well, let's
No,
define it as nature. Let's
Okay.
define it as
Okay,
these
yeah,
broader
a
things.
broader, I understand,
you know,
yeah, right.
Like
right.
a lot of broadcast spectrum in the United States was given away back
sure
in the
was.
1950s.
Yes, it was.
And because of those privileges, huge wealth was accumulated
Right.
through that.
Mhm.
Joseph Stiglitz, in his new book, The Price of Inequality, has some very good, interesting figures on where the concentrations of wealth come from.
Okay.
He uses a sort of modernistic term to cover all of this called rent seeking. The
Rent-seeking.
rent seeking, yeah.
Okay,
You're always
okay.
seeking to get special privileges for
Right.
something, right,
Uh-huh.
in some way. And the older term in classical political economy from Henry George and Ricardo and Adam Smith was economic rent. And
Okay.
economic rent was that peculiar return that went to land. And it was peculiar to land as a unique factor of production, just like wages were peculiar to labor,
Labor, yeah.
and profit or interest is peculiar yield to capital, right?
Right.
So we call that trifactor economics.
I see, okay.
And what happened...
Trifactor or
Trifecta.
trifecta?
The current economy is trifecta
Yeah, right,
because
right,
it's a
right,
betting,
right.
something
Yeah,
for
it's a
nothing.
crapshoot, yeah.
Well, something for
Yeah,
nothing
yeah,
economy.
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And,
yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
Now, some people portray George as a utopian and say, well, if we went to his system of public finance and that, and reduce taxes significantly, get rid of sales taxes and income taxes and just take public revenue from these community-created values, you'll get rid of all kinds of things. People live nicely together. There would be no crime and things like that. I don't think he was a utopian in that radical sense. I think he wanted to say, look, if you do this reform, it will make a lot of other reforms easier.
Okay.
That's the key.
Okay.
And this is a great thing about him that people don't really get, and it's a philosophical notion. He was a reconciler. He was able to reconcile economic efficiency with equity. We today always think of those things as trade-offs, right? We say, okay, well, taxation on income and sales taxes are inefficient. They drive a tax wedge, we call it, between things. But we need to do that so we can redistribute wealth a bit, and that's the equitable thing to do. So we always think of it as a trade-off, right? So, and that shows up in the political spectrum as well. I mean, these things have political overtones,
of course they do,
as most of the writers in the 19th
they're joined at the
century
hip.
did.
The politics and the economic is
But he tried
joined
to
at the hip.
reconcile these things and say you can have greater economic efficiency and greater equity, and you don't have to think of it as a trade-off. You can have these as mutually reinforcing things. in a community that takes community values for public finance, you will be able to have greater economic efficiencies and less distortion and so on in the economy. I mean, just think of the real estate market in Manhattan. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. I mean, from the standpoint of efficiency, and that, you know, and it's a shark's nest, and the barracudas
it really is. It really
reign
is,
supreme, right?
Yeah, there's terrible injustices going on.
Yeah,
all the time.
well, you can take that to a global level as well,
that's
with
right.
natural resource rents, you know, and monopolizations in oil and gas. The whole Mining Act and the revenue you get from mining in the United States is ridiculous. And and these things, like for instance, one thing we tried in Canada is to auction off some of the public spectrum, that the government would auction to the highest bidder the spectrum. And they did it and got $4.5 billion in revenue from it. They got more revenue than they thought they would. This was just 7 or 8 years ago. That's a very good way to raise public money, because what you're saying is, okay, the community as a whole owns that spectrum. You want to give a company
it's part of the natural
part of the natural world. We didn't create it; it was just there. We discovered it, but you know, it was just there, right?
That's an interesting liaison between the ability, because primitive man was born into a world, and all the resources, in a certain sense, were there. But there was a liaison between that condition and then the ability to take the extension of your consciousness with tools and technology and relate to that and build wealth and build a modern
we've created
world.
a lot of community values through public transit and things like that. But even in the more primitive world, as you say, where you have some fertile land in the Nile Valley, and a civilization grew up there because that was naturally. You had transportation. The Nile Valley got flooded every year, and this made the land very fertile. And Aristotle sort of says mathematics developed in that environment as civilization grew up, because they had to geometrically, because it got flooded all the time later.
I mean,
but I'm getting off topic a bit there. But
it's all right.
But the point is, there are
connected.
natural advantages to places. You're at the end of a river here, for instance, the Great Hudson River, and so this is a naturally advantageous place.
That's still the ports are all there, but also you had apparently we understand now to a couple 100,000 years we've been around. And for most of that time we were hunting and gathering in a very primitive way. We were very embedded in nature and very limited in terms of the ability to influence it. Then we got the invention of agriculture, Neolithic, about 8,000, 10,000 years ago.
So
wheat and rice, wheat and barley in the West, in European Mesopotamia, rice in China or Asia, maize in Central America, and the potato in South America were the four main food complexes that gave security in the beginning of civilization.
So you put those natural advantages together. Some land is more fertile than others.
Yes, that's true.
And you put it together with what we create in terms of transportation hubs and things like that. That is your community then that gets built up into this great city like New York. And so that became known as marginal theory. And Ricardo talked about that, right? That he has his models, his agricultural models of number of corn bushels, and as you go out to the margin, more is less fertile land.
Is that Marshall?
No, that's Ricardo, actually.
Well, I think of comparative advantage also.
Yeah, well, that's a trade. That's a trade, free trade issue, comparative advantage. But I'm just talking about what we call the margin. And George had studied. He was an autodidact. You know, he taught himself all these things.
That's a proud term, I think. Increasingly so in the age of the internet, don't you think? You can just educate yourself at the highest level now without any kind of sweat at all.
You have access to things that you would never
on your
would have
cell
before.
phone, I think you got the whole world.
Yeah, I got it all here in my pocket, right? It is off, by the way.
Okay, good. But you're well trained.
Yes. But he read Ricardo, and he read Adam Smith, for instance. And Adam Smith, for instance, says in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations that the least distortionary tax, this was 1776 this book came out, and he even said then, the least distortionary tax, the best tax is a tax on ground rent. Not on the house that's on it, but just taxes. And the land, he said all kinds of things that people didn't really understand, like the landlord couldn't shift that tax to someone else. Because you think of the tax haven issue today, right?
Oh my God!
And so we're going to tax. Well, I'll take all my wealth in some other form.
Cayman Islands.
And that, or today it's capital gains. You don't take it as income because capital gains is treated as a much lower rate, 15% in the United States right now. And so you don't get taxed on the things
There
that
are
you get
estimates
free.
between 20 and 30 trillion dollars are in
Right.
offshore accounts
Yeah.
that are hidden from
Yeah.
the various government
Yeah.
agencies.
Of course. But
And,
what-
and that ought
Yeah.
to be brought out writ large. That ought to be investigated in some sort
Yeah.
of publicly serviced way.
Well,
don't you
actually,
think? How
actually,
can they get away with
there is a
that?
big exposure
$30
recently on
trillion.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you can't hide land.
Oh,
Yeah, and you're
Well,
not taking
taken
it away
point.
with you. You're
Yeah,
not putting
that's
that in
true.
a tax haven somewhere part of the world,
That's
right?
true. That is true.
So
yeah.
it cuts down on tax cheating and all of those things. The point is that
Yeah.
if you get back for public uses this economic rent, as we call it, you solve a lot of other problems.
Right.
You get rid
it
of
helps
this.
set a template, maybe.
Yeah,
For
and
other issues.
you get
Yeah.
rid of all this huge parasitical tax industry, right? That's the lawyers and the accountants that spend all their time
Yeah.
just trying to figure out how to get the money to
Right,
the tax havens.
right.
And you get rid of a lot of very odd decision making economically. The business of deciding things on the basis of the tax regime and not
Right.
on the basis of just being business, right?
Yeah.
And what's good for the business itself.
Uh-huh.
And so we think that, at least people that subscribe to this philosophy, that we would, first of all, get a lot less inequality in our society if we started moving more in this direction. We would get better economic decision making amongst the actors, and people wouldn't be involved in speculation that much. You would get rid of a lot of speculation that's rife in the economy.
Right.
And you would also be able to make cities more functional in terms of the sprawl is a big issue, but just
Sure.
how we get money back for public transit and that, because public transit, for instance, creates huge land values.
Well, all
around them.
kinds of public things, public sector, private sector kind of world and everything with
Right.
public schools, public
Right.
facilities, public
All of that
transportation,
stuff
all kinds of things. The public
creates-
sector versus private sector kind of argument.
and in a way, it
Yeah.
would stop this conflict always between the public sector and the private
He
sector.
had he had this thinking, a wide intellectual community, politically connected community.
Yeah.
How much effect did he have? How much could he have had? How much should he have had? And those
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
things. And what happened to all of this good thinking that
Right,
seemed to make
right,
a lot of sense
right.
in terms of the movement
Yeah.
forward from, let's say, I don't know, to
yeah.
the 30s.
Well, that's an
20s.
excellent historical question, and
Yeah.
I would really like to see a lot more historians write about this whole period. Especially, he reached his peak globally in the early part of the 20th century, in the Edwardian era, if you
Right,
like.
yeah.
And he actually provoked a constitutional crisis in the English Parliament, that in parliamentary democracies now, the upper chamber, which was in England, the House of Lords, cannot block money bills anymore.
Is that right?
And with
because
Lloyd-
of his?
Because of Lloyd George, the
Uh-huh.
Prime Minister at the time,
Yeah.
and Winston Churchill, who
Uh-huh.
was involved, Chancellor of the Exchequer at one point there.
Did they
tried-
invoke his name?
They tried it. Oh, they sure did.
Okay,
And
uh-huh.
Churchill, for instance, gave
That's some pretty high-powered political.
pretty high-powered supporters there,
Yeah,
right? You know?
right.
And Churchill gave a tremendous speech
Mm-hmm.
in Edinburgh in 1909, I think, on this.
That's
It's
where my
widely
grandmother
quoted all
was
the
from,
time.
Edinburgh. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
But it provoked this crisis because they went to do like a modern day doomsday book,
Yeah,
the
right,
doomsday
right,
that was
right,
done
right.
after
I
William of Normandy,
Yeah, right.
to assess all the land in England.
Right.
And of course, the upper chamber of the English parliamentary structure, the House of Lords, were all landowners, right?
Right,
And they
right.
weren't going to have anything to do with
Right,
that, so
right,
they
right.
did everything to sort of stall it. Lloyd George was a very landed aristocrat person.
Okay.
And he was a real populist like that.
Yeah, we had.
And-
that was coming out of that whole 1,000 years
Yeah.
after Rome of dynastic families being political legitimacy.
Yeah, so they tried to do it do all the assessments of the land, because you have to assess the land for its value
Like
through
the Doomsday
through
Book, yeah.
through
Yeah,
through
yeah.
the inland revenue, and
Yeah.
this went on for years, and it kind of all collapsed by the beginning of the First World War.
Okay, and so his influence was there, and it was strong, and there was that. What happened to it from the period
Well,
on?
it was strong not only in England, though. I might add, in
Yeah.
Australia, there were many cities in Australia that did this. I might add right now something that's very current in South Africa.
Yes.
Johannesburg, for instance, had a Georges type of land value tax, we call it, or a site value tax.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a land clause in the South African Constitution, Section 25 of the Constitution, that we're taking a closer look at. to see if we can.
We being the Georges.
The Georges, but also people who are interested in land distribution issues in South Africa.
Absolutely huge.
Because I mean they're in a terrible state, you know, in terms of economic inequality.
As is much of the world over the same issue.
Over the same issue, it's everywhere. It's universal. So it was all over the world, in Canada, in a lot of Western cities, in Alberta and British Columbia were on his system. A lot of the early mayors in the 20th century in Canada, like L.D. Taylor in Vancouver, were ardent Georgists, and they had a site value or land value tax system in place there at the time. I'd like to see people write a little more history of that, and I think that's a huge gap in our historical understanding, not just from the economics perspective, because if you look in the States, there's a political history there as well. He ran for mayor of New York twice.
He did.
Being mayor of New York is a stepping stone at that time to the presidency. He got involved with the labor guilds a lot here in New York. He was a very populist thinker. He critiqued Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, which was his big thing on workers' rights, and he said, well, you know, a lot of that stuff's good, but you miss one big issue, right? And so he got into this controversy with the Catholic Church, and Edward McGlynn, who was a very rebel, feisty priest here at St. Stephen's Parish in New York, got excommunicated over this whole issue, right?
That issue resonates today. But he was also a person that had suffered personally in his own life poverty. He was also a Jack London adventurer. He had a lot of. He had a very.
Went around the world at age 16,
and he was an autodidact, like you say. So an admirable American figure, you know, and everything. And then it gets down, so what is this continuing influence in terms of you read things now, or let's say Depression times, Second World War, and the period leading up to the present, where does he stand, and where ought he stand in terms of understanding and informing the political classes?
Well, he's not on the radar screen today either.
At all, he's completely gone.
In any of the disciplines.
What happened that all that went away? If that's the case?
I think you can respond to that question in different ways.
What was the political reality that led to that, or the thinking?
Right. Well, you can respond to that in a number of ways. There's the political reality of entrenched interests just wanted to not have his name out there, but also there was a big. But another point, there was a big change in economics.
Okay.
And
when are you talking now?
Well, there are various ways. Well, you could even say back into the marginalist revolution. In the by the time George wrote his book, the economics was going in a different trajectory academically. Okay. And we call it neoclassical economics. And Mason Gaffney has written a very good book on this. He was on your program a little while ago.
He was aired yesterday when this program aired.
Called The Corruption of Economics, and he shows in that book how you get a transformation of the whole concept of land into this abstract capitalist sort of concept, and it moved from tri-factor economics we were talking about to two-factor, maybe even one-factor economics, and land sort of disappears as a unique factor of production in that whole development, and he traced the history of that. So that's one thing.
He's a wonderful fellow. Got a droll sense of humor that is magnificent. He's given best regards. He's a great guy.
Well, at the Schockenbach Foundation, we're producing a few videos, and you always put the talking heads on the videos. And we put Mason on a few times. And we walk him around to these sites where there's new condos going up, and he'll explain, you know, what's going wrong here, right?
He's like Mark Twain or something, or you know, something like that. Mentioning that, well, you did bring in a DVD. You brought in a DVD with a couple of minutes of footage. Maybe this is the time since we brought it up. That has to do with educating the general public. And so maybe you could
we at the Schockenbach Foundation are trying to get more into multimedia and all the social media stuff. And
you should link up with Manhattan Network and
we might do that.
Good, I think it's a good idea. We'd like to enlist you as faculty.
All right. Well, we could certainly supply a few feisty figures, that's for sure. We produced a little video called On Solid Ground. It's about 12 minutes long, and it's on our website, workandwealth.com.
Workandwealth.com. All one word, lowercase?
All one word, lowercase.
Okay.
And what we're going to look at now is a short trailer, about 2 minutes or so, that is an introduction, basically, just like the big movies do little trailers. So this is a trailer it's an introduction to that
Who
longer
put
video.
the trailer together, or who put the piece
Well,
together?
I put.
Did you do all the technical stuff? And
well, I
everything,
didn't
or
do
did you
it
have a couple
myself.
of 7-year-olds
but-
who could put it together right?
Yeah. Well, we had a team up in Canada
Yeah,
of people
right.
who are expert at this stuff.
Well, you got a lot of experience with the Canadian Film Board. I'll tell you, they informed
Yeah,
a lot of what's
yeah.
going on down here, and Canadian has a great tradition in
Yeah.
that. So
Well, Schockenbach
maybe-
sponsored this, and
Good.
we put a team together, and this is what we're going to take a
Okay,
peek
well,
at.
let's see if we can't set that up and run it now. Then we're talking with Francis Peddle, and let's set it up and run that tape a couple minutes only, okay?
Right.
And if we could run that, here we go. It looks like we're running now, okay?
This is unacceptable!
Well, I'm living in a tent right now mainly because I want to be seen by Capitol Hill and the White House right at the end of the street. There are tons of people who are discontent with how the country is being run right now.
And they said, well, thank you for applying. In addition to you, 750 applicants also applied for this job.
Employees have a disgruntled feeling as far as competitive versus core group, making $10, up to $10 less an hour on average. But members of this local that are true to the local and are heartfelt with this local know that that was the reason it had to be done, was to get them in this plant. Otherwise, we were going to lose our livelihood and lose the plant from being here.
Once you don't have income, everything can be chaotic.
And then we throw up our hands and say it's terrible. Our economy has run down. We can no longer create jobs. But if you look at the governmental causes of this, they're easy to identify and easy to correct.
The proposal that we're making is to replace the regressive taxes, those that hurt commerce and those that hurt production, with a more progressive tax. That tax would be a tax on the rental value of land. Land in California represents about $3.5 trillion of value.
Our tax system is so pathological that it rewards speculators for holding land off the market, employing no one, even while it penalizes people for working, saving, and producing.
You'll see acres and acres of parking. Acres a mere few blocks from the U.S. Capitol. Acres that should be providing housing for people, employment for people, and not parking for cars. The way to avoid this problem is for the public sector to recapture and recycle the land values that it creates itself.
That's the key to making jobs.
Working wealth is on the tape. That's
Right.
very interesting. It's really Mason was there. It was very good. Like
Yes, yes.
it's really interesting like that, and it's very good. Congratulations. And the piece is on your site. And,
Yes,
yeah,
the longer video,
Yeah.
which is about 12-13 minutes, is
Spells
on the
it
site.
out a little bit
we
more
have
what it
we have
is.
more of the talking heads, as we usually say, on there. But I would encourage people to look at the Schockenbach website even more.
Sure.
We have a fair bit of information up there on how to think about
Maybe
this concept.
you could say, what is the Robert Schockenbach website? Put it out.
Right.
www what?
Right. Well, Schockenbach, just Schockenbach.org is the site. So,
Schockenbach.
yeah, yeah.
And Robert Schockenbach was?
He was a
Georgist, I
typographer.
think, or
Yes, he
typographer.
was. He was a typographer here in New York, and around 1925 he set up the foundation in his will, and it says pretty straightforwardly to teach, expound, and propagate the ideas of Henry George.
That's good. That's
And-
really good to have
and-
such a thing, is it not?
And
Yeah.
it's still, it
yeah.
has a continuous history now, Schockenbach, of
Yeah.
publishing and advocating and doing research on Henry George for well over well over 75. That's like, how many years is that? We're looking at 88 years now.
That's a classy act. My daddy used to say, if you're going to bet horses, bet class. So if
Well,
you're going to bet class, that was a classy argument then. It's one that still has application
Yeah, well,
now.
we're not here for a good time. We're here for a long time.
Okay, right,
so,
right,
So
long
we
term.
intend to be around. And
yeah.
we have a board of 21 people
Yeah.
from various aspects of life, a lot of economists, of course, but people do a lot of other things, and it's a fascinating board. And we sponsor research to some extent, but we also do publishing and distribution of books on Henry George.
Right.
And we've been the mainstay of that for a
Right,
long time.
including the classic Wealth and Poverty.
No, Progress and Poverty is the classic,
Progress and Poverty, which is the
there are
standard.
there are other famous books too. There's more of a condensation, if you want to put it that way, that George put out a couple of years later, called Social Problems, and in a way that's easier to approach. I mean, getting people to read a 600-page book today is not easy.
Not easy.
Not easy, but you condense down the book fairly significantly. He did that in Social Problems. When he ran for mayor of New York again...
When was that?
Well, he ran first in 1886 and lost narrowly to Abram Hewitt. People think the whole thing was rigged, and there are some writings on that.
I'm shocked.
I know,
Boss Tweed.
I know. Boss Tweed's running the show.
Yeah.
But Hewitt was no slouch either.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Then he was persuaded, and it was probably not a good idea, but he was persuaded to run again in 1897. And he died during the campaign of exhaustion. And in my view, from the academic standpoint, the greater tragedy even is he didn't finish his magnum opus, which is The Science of Political Economy.
How far did he get? Or?
He got a big chunk of it, but there's chapters on production and that in there that are just titles, and he didn't work the chapters out. There's a sort of thing on money that he put in the end of that's pretty embryonic. He could have went a lot further.
How old was he when he passed?
Well, he was born in 1839, so he would have been 58. Around
58,
there. Yeah,
young,
so pretty
too
young,
young.
relatively young. He was exhausted. I mean, his oratorical art and his oratorical skills were phenomenal.
Yeah.
He was a spellbinding speaker.
Yeah.
All the testimony we have from that period, the speeches he gave were just, he was a very charismatic figure.
Anybody
in
in
that
the
way.
modern experience that could go along with his thinking and also with his ability at oratory and convincing the public?
We're always keeping an eye out for that person.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
those skills are, combining his analytical skills, his discipline to just be able to teach himself so much, his will and his industriousness, if you like, and diligence, he's a pretty unique figure. I mean, he was an extraordinary figure to people around him. And one of the best things to read are some of the comments at his funeral, which was a massive funeral here in New York.
It was.
There was 100,000 people at it or something.
Everybody was,
and
he was a darling among the intellectual class, worldwide.
Well, not academically, though. He was a darling amongst people like you said,
well, that's
Tolstoy.
what I mean, the real intellectual class, the real
people doing
groundbreakers.
things, right?
Yeah,
but not in the
usually
university.
those people that are of that way don't fit really nicely into the established order. They're usually they're kind of feisty and outside, and something new developing.
I've always been interested in some ways in obscure figures. One of my early books was on Albert Schweitzer, for instance, who's not in mainstream philosophy at all. Bertrand Russell said, well, Schweitzer, he's not even a philosopher at all, right? And people may say the same thing about Henry George. Oh, he's not even a philosopher. But I disagree. I think he really was of that higher order philosophical, where he could bring a lot of different disciplines together.
John Stuart Mill?
John Stuart Mill had that tremendous ability as well.
Were they connected at all?
Well, he critiqued Mill a lot. I mean, he studied Mill's Principles of Political Economy quite closely, which, as you know, came out the same year as the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And George studied that, but then he critiqued Mill's whole theory of the origin of property, which George said was immoral. It was morally based. Mill said it was institutionally based through laws, the development of laws and so on. And he goes into that critique quite a bit in the first part of The Science of Political Economy. But on the other hand, he did get a lot from Mill too, and Mill had things to say about economic rent and stuff like that. So
now, what about the others of the canon? We say, use it, put in quotes.
Right.
You know, you get Keynes, the giant, that informed the 30s and also after 48, Bretton Woods and all that.
Yeah, Keynes will be viewed as a bit of an enemy amongst many Georgians. Okay, they
Okay.
don't subscribe to the Keynesian.
What about
the Keynesians.
Schumpeter, who was who had a lot of conflict, a major entrepreneurial
Schumpeter
destruction and all that?
has a very, very good section in the history of economic analysis, which is one of the, in my view, most important economic texts of
He's
the 20th
part of the
century.
Austrian school, or would he be, or he's late?
Well, that's that's a different thing. But Schumpeter has a section there, and he says anybody who says that Henry George is not a real economist is totally wrong. This guy knew economics, right?
Okay.
Because a lot of people say today, like what Russell said about Albert Schweitzer, oh, he's not really a philosopher. Say, well, George is not really an economist. He was a moralist, or he's a religious fanatic, and he created a cult, you know, and he was a rhetorician and hornswoggled labor into thinking that he could save them all from their own, you know.
Well, and then we get down to some of the practical reality. Let's say coming out of the Second World War, we had a depression. We had, I think Keynes informed a good deal of the New Deal thinking. No, I think in terms of developing demand, and also to encourage the public sector activity in terms of things. And we came out, if I may, we come out of we have Bretton Woods after the Second World War. Keynes was very influential there as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so you get a private sector, public sector thing that still is a dialectic that informs everything. But after the Second World War, and when Eisenhower was the president, we had income rates on income of something like 90%. Did we not?
We did.
And it seemed to, the economy seemed to buzz right along and everything. So what is the relationship between the public sector and the private sector in terms of the economic policy-making, decision-making process?
The rates, in one sense, are irrelevant, and I think you're hinting at that. The real issue is what you exempt, or what you tax, or what you don't tax.
Oh, how you let it get around the rules?
Right. Well,
it's
right? Not getting around the rules. Just look at now at capital gains in the United States. It's virtually untaxed. So if you get something for nothing, in a sense, that is capital gain, you're not taxed. If you work hard,
or if you can avoid it.
Well, but if you work hard, you get taxed to the hill.
That's right.
So you get penalized for being a productive member of our society.
Sales tax
if you're not a productive member, you get rewarded. You know.
So that's influence of the well-to-do on the political process.
Well, some would say it's the 1% running everything, and they've rigged the laws.
You had some of that in your piece there.
We did.
Were you in sympathy with that blossomed, you know, a year or so ago with the 1%?
George would be in sympathy with anybody who's downtrodden. He would have been down on Wall Street.
He would have been down
there. He'd be up on a stump there giving speech every day.
Giving great oratory.
Very good oratory down there.
And he would have been advocating within the current context what?
Yes.
What policy decisions that are currently before our Congress or our political leadership would be recommended by the Georgists or by George himself, were he here, in terms of the current situation that came after 2008,
well,
just to bring it up to date?
He would say that the gross inequalities we have in our society are not a natural thing. They are something that we have created, and they are despicable and diabolical
and obscene.
And they're crushing most of the people in
our
society.
And why is it that they're there, and why are they countenanced by the political process when you have, is the leadership co-opted by the vested interest? Is it monopoly of power and influence in the society? What causes this, rather than a more
I think you would say
salubrious
well, I think you would
order.
Say that. I mean, you know, you could say that generally, how you actually nail it down. But you know what? I'll give you one example. What I tried to do in a book I wrote about 15 years ago called Cities and Greeds, Taxes, Inflation, and Land Speculation, tried to show how you could change a municipal tax structure. You know, changing things nationally is very difficult, right? But you go into it.
Vested interest.
And we've tried to do this in a number of places where you go in and you say, okay, you've got a total tax bill on a property.
Okay.
There's two aspects to that bill. One is a good aspect and one is a bad aspect of it. And people mix it up all the time, right? So the tax on the building is bad because it penalizes you for improving your property or doing things that are beneficial to the community. The tax on the land component is good because that doesn't penalize you. So the current system penalizes you for doing something good and rewards you. If you let the property run down and let termites and rats take it over, the tax system will reward you for that, right? So we tried to change that dynamic, change those incentives. So the system will reward you for doing something that's beneficial for yourself and the rest of the community, and giving you basically the tax will be on something that's bad, which is speculation, right, on the land component.
Good idea.
And you could
it
do
would
that.
seem to be a good idea that
Yeah.
would appeal to a lot of people if they could have it in their consciousness as a possibility.
Yeah, well
No?
Mason Gaffney, our friend
Yeah,
again, once
yeah.
said that economic rent is not in the consciousness of most economists, except when it comes to their personal pocketbooks.
Oh,
right?
I see.
So,
Yeah.
so but these are little things. I mean, you can do this in piecemeal ways, right?
Okay.
Another good thing would be building depreciation in the Internal Revenue Code. It's
Okay.
ridiculous that when companies, or especially real estate companies and that, give all the value to the building and very little value to the land, 10 or 15%. And everybody knows the value of the land is much higher often in these portfolios. But the financial statements are not cross-indexed with the property assessments of the local municipalities and that.
Why are they not?
Because nobody wants to get the economic intelligence on this stuff. Because not having the intelligence and the information on it is a great thing for you if you have these monopolistic powers.
Oh, you
They
can
don't want it to,
manipulate
you
it.
can well, you can manipulate it and you say, oh, well, it's not true, or, you know, you just, so we have no real intelligence on this. Because many people who are looking at this, like Nick Tiedemann and Gaffney and others who are, you know, bona fide economists at universities, basically say that the land component in our economy is a lot higher than any of the economic data in the national income and productivity accounts shows. It could be up as much as 40% of the economy. But if you actually look at what's
40%?
Yeah, the income that's there to the land component, or if you just take the total GDP of how much that is, and it's huge, right? But it's not there if you look at the official statistics. In that,
Well, are
right?
there political backsides to be protected, or something that makes it so that we don't have such accounting or such information available
Well, Ronald
to
Reagan
us to
got
make
rid of that
decisions?
stuff. The Federal Reserve was doing that stuff, some of that analysis 30 years ago, and he got rid of it. Right.
What does that mean? What does that
Well,
say
he
about
just-
the political process
Well,
and the larger intellectual leadership of the
that
country?
knowledge is power, and not having knowledge is even more power in some sense. And not having
Okay.
knowledge about this, it really is in the interests of some people.
Is there some
right?
political class or movement or vision or something that could encompass the good kind of data that could be used in order to inform the
Well,
public?
one
Or is there a movement along
One thing
those
we're
lines
doing now is
that
going
would
to
be progressive in the best sense of the
well,
word?
one thing we're working on and sponsoring is a land value map of Manhattan.
Okay.
And we could expand it in New York City as a whole. You can do these things. I did it for the city of Montreal up in Canada 15 years ago under the Bédard Commission. We did a report to that commission, and I looked at all the land values in the city of Montreal. And they
map it out and everything?
well, you map it out, you look at all the property information that you get. It's available publicly. And now we have, of course, GIS stuff, and we can really map it out a lot.
GIS?
That's,
General-
you know, where you do land, you know, you have mapping, you're a geographer, you were your
well,
life.
yeah,
and-
but I wasn't a very good cartographer. You know, as it
well,
happened,
you
but-
can have maps. You can have land
Yeah,
maps.
maps
of
are
cities,
wonderful,
And
yeah.
you can put all this on the internet,
Yeah.
you know, and just so it's all publicly available, and people will be able to see what the value of these things are. And so this is
That
really
would be
important.
data. That would be
That would
basic
be
data
real
that could be
important
available
basic
in
stuff.
order to make a premise that could get some political support for
Exactly.
making change.
And very few
Yeah.
people are doing that type of research.
Why are they doing? Why are there few people doing that? Why are the foundations not influencing that? Why are the people that are progressively minded not doing it?
Right,
Or what's
because-
holding it up?
Well,
Or holding up, and not that. That's one
Right.
thing. That other piecemeal things. What's holding up the progressive movement of us toward a more rational economic order for the people of the world?
well, that,
What's the major
that
problem?
is quite a question.
Yeah, well, you're a
if I
philosopher
if I could
major.
break through that one, how many hours do we have?
Yeah.
If I could break through that one, it'd be pretty good. I think a lot of the law that we have, one answer to that is a lot of the law we have, and I was a tax litigator. I was a lawyer also for 20 years up in Canada.
You've done a
so-
law degree.
Yeah, I have a law degree, and I have my own law firm for 20 years, and we did a lot of tax litigation,
yeah,
right? Property tax assessment appeals and things like
Yeah,
that.
right.
And the law does not define, the way I just described it to you, a house
Yeah.
as something that sits on a piece of land. It
Right.
just says real estate includes land and buildings. Land is defined as including land and buildings. But every economist knows that if you tax something that is natural, like the land, you're going to get a very different effect than if you tax the building. That's a very basic thing. You know, you don't get the distortionary effects that are so on. And that's kind of universal. I mean, most economists agree with that. You get very little controversy.
Yeah.
You know, usually economics, you put 5 of them in a room and you get
Oh,
6
it's
opinions and
chaos.
all that. Chaos, right? But they don't really disagree with that. It's amazing, you know, some basic...
Well, we ought to get some of those things
Yeah.
that we can agree
Yeah.
upon
Yeah.
across the political
Right.
spectrum
Right.
also. Yeah,
Right,
if
and
we
that's
could.
one of them. And
It's
that's
pretty
been
grim
there
now,
since
yeah.
Adam Smith.
Yeah.
You know, that sort of basic fundamental principle has been there for such a long time, right?
So we had a worrying, you got a couple minutes left. We had Mr. Bernanke and all those people coming in 2008 saying we have to bail out, we have to do all the things we have to do in order to save the system, or we're going to get into what would be 100 times worse than the Great Depression. They had to they had to take all these measures, and here we are at this pass now in terms of the world economy. What are your prescriptions for the world toward an operating manual for spaceship Earth that can take into account the actual realities that exist in order to give intellectual fodder to the political leadership that could bring about a better, a qualitatively better condition for the world society within an ecological context.
Well, one thing, just before we get into that, I should point out
We only
that
got about 30 seconds.
Bernanke said in 2006 we're going to have a soft landing, and there was no problem
Yeah,
really.
yeah,
so
yeah,
you have
No,
to
but
wonder who you're going to trust
I
there.
understand. Given that, where
think-
whence goeth us now?
I think,
in your view,
I think we're going to be into another cycle unless we make some changes along the lines.
another
of
18-year-old cycle.
I think we're going to be right into it again,
Yeah.
and it's going to. The next one is going to be a lot worse because the U.S. government, for instance, is not going to be able to issue
I
bonds.
think my
to keep
question
it
was
going.
asking you, sir, what do we do to avoid that and move into a policy that is going to bring us unending positive growth for the American society, the world society,
and
and
a more
the ecology.
equitable, and a more equitable society.
And a more equitable
well, I think
society.
I think
you
we
got 40 seconds for that.
Well, I can answer it easily. I think people have to start taking a serious look at Henry George.
Oh,
again.
right. Well,
and,
you know.
and I think Robert Schockenbach Foundation can help us do that.
Okay, right. Henry George. Are there any others? Are there some of the economic canon? You know, I like Lewis Carroll, so I don't know. I'm just trying to get a feeling of it and everything. And some other things. He's outside the canon and that. But are there any others that link up naturally with the philosophy and the philosophical thrust of George that are in the canon that we could talk? Who are the allies that are in the normal order? We only have about a minute left.
Yeah, I think there's, you know...
Keynesians?
No, they're not really Keynesian. I think you got to go back...
Schumpeter, you seem to like?
Schumpeter was not bad on George, although he didn't really. He's
Who
all
was
over
good?
the map.
Who was good
Well,
that's still relevant today to the political class
well,
and
I think you
control
can
of
go back
planet
to
Earth?
some people who wrote... In some ways, Ricardo is excellent on this point, and Adam Smith in Book 5. Contemporary, well, I would look at Gaffney's work. I think he's done the most important work in the post-Second World War period.
No, but he's
on
a George.
expanding.
What about the people that are in the
but-
Democratic Party, the Republican Party?
Oh, forget it.
You know,
I don't know anybody there. Would be,
you can't.
well,
That's
David,
very discouraging.
Well, Dennis Kucinich, I think,
Dennis
to some
Kucinich,
extent.
he lost his Ohio seat.
He lost his seat.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
But Gaffney lays out a research agenda in this text here called The Hidden Taxable Capacity of Land that is, I think, should keep many economists going for many years.
Okay, well, I tell you, we're good. Thank you very much for coming
very
in
nice being
and
here.
for such a very well-led life. It's been your pleasure to have the perception then of Francis Peddle, the Ph.D., president of Robert Schockenbach. We give you the site. You can go to get information on that very interesting work of and contributions of Henry George, and that the people we can link it up to. Thanks a lot. Let's hope we can avoid another one of those kind of crazy kind of things that we've just gone through and so forth. And we all should repair to the Schockenbach Foundation and pick up on the legacy of Henry George.
Thank you very much, Harold.
All people of good spirit.